Did you know that when you transplant your broccoli, if you slide a small white piece of paper at the base of the stem, you can prevent your broccoli from potentially dying from a pest known as cabbage maggot? Cabbage maggot comes from the fly cabbage fly, which is different from the cabbage moth, and it comes and lays its eggs at the base of a broccoli plant. And then when those eggs hatch, the larvae burrow down into the soil and start eating the roots of the broccoli itself. You won't even know that you have this pest or this issue until you start to see your broccoli wilting and the leaves turning yellow and purple. And by then, it has done so much damage that the roots will not recover. So by sliding this piece of paper right around the roots, you prevent the cabbage fly from being able to lay its eggs.
It's really clever, and it's an example of what's called the physical control of pests. Hey, Dirt Magicians, this is my first year growing broccoli, and Bree's gonna help me. There are so many pests, especially the cabbage maggot, and that can totally decimate broccoli after you spend all this time and energy nurturing it and growing the plant. So I've been a little bit afraid to try, to be totally frank.
Luckily, Dee, my years of urban farming and all of the trial and error I've done have taught me a way to grow broccoli that is pest-free and doesn't spray anything. We're mostly going to use physical controls. And I will also show you how you can get multiple harvests of broccoli from just one plant.
Woohoo! So exciting! Let's dive in then.
All right, Dee, so step one for growing broccoli is to start our seeds indoors. Broccoli can actually take between 100 and 150 days from seed to harvest. So we want to get a head start on the growing season by starting it indoors. And we can do this either for a spring planting or a fall planting.
Wait, Bree, on the back of my seed packet it says 50 to 80 days, so I think you have the number of days wrong.
I understand your confusion, Dee, and that's because when it says 50 to 80 days on the back of a broccoli seed packet, it actually means from transplant, not from when you put the seed in the ground. What I find really frustrating about seed packets is that you never know when they mean from seed or from transplant until you get more familiar with the plants themselves.
Oh yeah, that is very confusing. Wait, so then broccoli is a cool weather crop, and if it takes that long to grow and be ready for harvest, then won't I be growing it in the peak of the summer? And how is the weather gonna work with this being a cold weather crop?
You're bang on, Dee, and that's why it's so important to start your seeds indoors. If we were going to plant our broccoli outside, we wouldn't be able to start our seeds until after the last frost, which is March 28th. Whereas if we start the seeds indoors, I start them all the way back in February. So it just gives a broccoli plant more time to grow in a cooler environment. And then for fall plantings, I start it in July. Yes, it's the heat of the summer, but it's usually a lot cooler in our homes. And then I'm not transplanting it out until the beginning of August. When starting your seeds, make sure you are mixing a nutrient-rich compost with your seed starting mix, as broccoli needs a lot more nutrients than many other vegetables. So for seeding, you're gonna wanna make a 1/2-inch hole into your soil and put 2 to 3 seeds in there and then just lightly close it. I highly recommend that you get grow lights for broccoli, as they are known to get very leggy if they're put in a windowsill. And that's because there's just not enough light. And by leggy, I mean the stems are gonna stretch towards the light.
Yeah, that makes sense. I usually do that for my seed starts anyways. But what would you recommend for people that don't have the space to start seeds indoors?
If you can't seed indoors, I recommend buying a transplant right after your first frost in the spring, or 4 months before your first frost if you're wanting to grow for the fall. Okay, let's move on to transplanting, which is when most of the care occurs for our broccoli, both in fertilization and pest prevention. In the Pacific Northwest, my transplant date is going to be 2 weeks after my first frost in the spring. So I usually transplant around mid-April. And then if I'm going to be transplanting for the fall, I usually do that at the end of July. Now, before transplanting, make sure to mix 2 to 3 inches of a nutrient-rich compost into your soil. This is because broccoli, as I mentioned, needs more nutrients than other vegetables. It's called a heavy feeder. So this will make sure there is lots of nutrients. And a month after transplanting, I also like to add a dose of fish fertilizer to my broccoli plants. Now, when you're purchasing using a fish fertilizer, make sure that both the first and the third number on the container are greater than 2 to make sure there is enough nitrogen, which is the first number, and potassium, which is the third number.
I love the fish fertilizer for all of my plants that are considered to be heavy feeders. It gives them a real big boost in their growth. Another thing that's going to give the broccoli a good boost to grow is the like button. Well, maybe it won't help the broccoli grow, but it'll help the channel grow. So if you're getting value from this, then definitely hit the like button and subscribe to Dirt Magicians. But back up for a second. How far apart should I transplant my broccoli?
Typically between 16 to 18 inches, or if you're growing in containers, then just 1 broccoli plant per container.
Bree, didn't you also mention that when we transplant is when we want to put some controls in place for pest prevention?
That's right, Dee. There's a few things we're going to do now in the planting season that are going to prevent pests for broccoli for the rest of its growing season. So the first pest prevention thing we're going to do is plant broccoli in a different location, like a different garden bed or a different container than the year previously. And this is because a lot of the pests and diseases of broccoli and many other vegetables overwinter in the soil. So if we move the location, then when those pests wake up in the spring, they don't have access to the plant and they're not always smart enough to figure out the new location and they're more likely to die. Now, you don't have to worry about this because this is your first year growing broccoli, but you also want to make sure that you're not planting in a location that had other brassicas as they share the same pests and diseases. So a reminder, brassicas are things like cauliflower, cabbage, and kale. Now that the location has been selected, the broccoli's been transplanted, the next thing we're going to do is slide that piece of paper around the base of the plant, like I mentioned, to help prevent cabbage maggot. And then the next step is to add what I call slug be gone if you're Canadian, or sluggo if you live in the US. And this is a wheat pellet, which attracts the slugs. And then the wheat pellet is surrounding what's called orthophosphate, which is iron phosphate, which is toxic to slugs.
Do I have to worry about it being toxic for my family or animals then?
Nope, and this is why I love this product so much, is because it is non-toxic to humans and or pets and only toxic to slugs.
Well, that's cool. But what about things like eggshells or beer traps as a form of pest control?
Well, Dee, as I mentioned, I've done a lot of trial and error around pest control for broccoli. And of the various controls that you mentioned, I've also tried diatomaceous earth, but still out of all of them, slug be gone I have found has been the most effective. The one thing I will note is you do need to do a couple of reapplications throughout the year to make sure it continues to be effective. Let us know in the comments what slug controls you like. All right, so our next step in pest prevention is to cover our broccoli transplants with what is called row cover or remay. And that is this light, white, airy material that allows both air and sunlight in.
Yeah, also known as toilet paper in the garden, as my daughter Arya coined it. And what does it do?
Row cover is used to prevent what are called cabbage moth caterpillars from decimating our broccoli. So cabbage moth is a moth, and it likes to lay its eggs on the underside of the leaves of a broccoli plant. And then when those eggs hatch, the caterpillar gets to work. So when we cover it with this material, the cabbage moth comes along and has nowhere to land, and so it can't lay any eggs. This also helps with aphid and flea beetle control, as they can't get into the sort of enclosure you've created with the row cover.
Wow, row cover is so important. I guess it's gonna save me a lot of time not having to worry about cabbage moth caterpillars and all of those other pesky insects. Who knew?
Dirt Magicians, if you want to learn more about organic, safe ways to control pests in your garden, then we have a mini course for you. In this mini course, we will go over identification and control measures for these pests, as well as talk about how to create an ecosystem in your garden to help bring the beneficial predatory insects of garden pests while keeping the garden pest populations low.
If you're going to spend all of this time growing these vegetables, you might as well learn how to equip yourself with the skills to make sure that they're not decimated by both pests and diseases. So click on the link in the description box below to access that mini course. All right, Bree, so my broccoli is all tucked in, protected from pests, fully fertilized. So now let's talk about harvesting. How do I know when it's time to harvest my broccoli?
Great question, Dee. So the way we know the plant is ready to harvest is that the little balls on the broccoli itself are going to start to get bigger because they want to open and flower, which indicates that the plant is no longer going to grow larger, it's just going to put energy into shooting up and flowering. So you want to harvest when the little balls on your broccoli head are starting to get bigger. Also, and this is important, when we harvest, we don't want to pull the broccoli plant out. We just want to cut right below the first stem where the next set of leaves are going to be coming out. And this is because in each one of those little armpits along the broccoli, new shoots will come up and we'll actually end up getting broccolini all season long.
Oh wow, I had no idea broccoli could provide that much harvest. And I also always thought broccolini was a different plant. So that's really cool to know that it's all a part of the same plant. All right, let's talk about row cover for a second. So row cover can be expensive and it's not in every gardener's budget. So if you want to learn how to deal with cabbage moth, there are actually many options and many controls you can explore. And there's so many that we made a whole video just about that, and you can click here to watch it.